CRS had a report in 2020 where if someone born in India was applying for a green card in the EB2 category, which is employment-based second preference category, then they would have to wait 195 years before they would get a green card. They projected that that number would grow to about, I believe, 436 years in 2030.
What do we talk about when we talk about tech policy? What are weird corners of the CHIPS and Science Bill? How is talent policy broken, and what can anyone do about it? And broadly, if you want to change the world through better regulatory and executive action, how do you go about this? To discuss all of the following and more, we have on today Divyansh Kaushik, a sixth-year PhD candidate studying machine learning at Carnegie Mellon. He is also a science and technology fellow at the Federation for American Scientists, focusing on emerging tech policy, and was closely involved with the CHIPS and Science Bill negotiations. Divyansh, thanks so much for coming on China Talk. So what do we talk about when we talk about tech policy?
When you look at how people talk about tech policy now, especially with the key phrase that Brian Deese came up with, the modern industrial strategy, we leave out how to make it successful. We are talking a lot about, okay, how much money on what, where, when, but how are we making sure we're getting the most bang for the buck? That is clearly something that we should be paying a lot more attention to. Otherwise, what we end up with is like billion-dollar boondoggles with nothing to show for. So, CHIPS and Science Act, especially, is one area where we need to talk about how to make it successful. Congress has done some really good things around creating a STEM workforce for the future. 100% behind that amazing effort that they've put in. They actively consulted everybody that they could, and that was quite amazing. Like, I did not expect that there would be, emails coming from staffers that, hey, we want to talk to grad students who are doing research on the ground. So if we are going to send all this money out, we want to know how to make it most effective. And that's great. At the same time, a lot of that in the CHIPS and Science Bill is authorization, right? The only appropriations are for the chip subsidies and the $250 million for semiconductor workforce development. Plus, there are a few other appropriations as well. And yet, at the same time, you have Congress trying to increase the graduate research fellowship program from 2,000 to 3,000 fellowships a year, which is amazing. It's the flagship fellowship of the National Science Foundation. It's very competitive, has produced a lot of Nobel laureates, secretaries of energy. It's amazing. Yet, if we are not able to get to those 3,000 fellowships just because Congress does not appropriate the money, or NSF ends up in implementation barriers, they don't have the people to staff it or whatnot, then it'll be very hard to achieve those goals that Congress was trying to achieve through this authorization bill.
Let's start by talking in general about the politics around talent policy. I don't know how far back you want to go, but maybe we can bound it with just high-skilled immigration. What are the sort of different competing factors and arguments, and where are the kind of battle lines drawn on this topic in particular?
Right. So I guess you have to go back to the 1990s for that. Congress decided where we're going to set aside 140,000 green cards each year for employment-based categories. And now that includes spouses and dependents. So about half of those are going to spouses and dependents. Only about 70,000 go to principals. Now, the economy has tripled since then. That number has not gone up. How does that affect us? Well, the backlogs for people born in India or China have grown decades long. I believe CRS had a report in 2020 where if someone born in India was applying for a green card in the EB2 category, which is employment-based second preference category, then they would have to wait 195 years before they would get a green card. That was the CRS's estimate in 2020. they projected that that number would grow to about, I believe, 436 years in 2030. Now, not that any of that matters. Nobody's living 195 years, let alone 436. For China, the numbers were slightly lower, but they were still just like decades-long backlogs because we have grown the economy. We need this workforce. We do not have the population to meet the needs of the economy. And yet, for some reason, we do not, like, we love the benefits this workforce is creating for the economy overall, but for some reason, we do not want to provide them a predictable path to, like, to residence, to just, like, assimilating in our communities as citizens eventually. And that's creating a lot of problems. Fast forward, like, from 1990s to on the political side, like, if you look at, there have been two major attempts to pass like a comprehensive immigration reform bill. There was one in 2007, which failed in the Senate. There was a Senate compromise in 2013, which passed with a huge bipartisan majority. But the House Freedom Caucus made sure that Speaker Boehner never brought it up for a vote in the House. They had the votes to pass it in the House. The bill would have exempted STEM PhD holders from annual caps. Like, why do we even have these caps for? If you're saying someone is exceptional ability, that is quite literally what they call the EB1 criteria, like your extraordinary ability individual. So, well, okay, if you're an extraordinary ability individual in the applying for an EB1A category, then why should you be subject to those 140,000 caps? Well, we should be inviting all of you in. That's quite literally what Canada does. That's what UK does. New Zealand, Australia, Israel. What are we doing here? So they tried to fix that in 2013, didn't go anywhere. Since then, we've had a lot of education polarization, and immigration has become a very hot topic. When people talk about immigration, the first visual that comes to anybody's mind is, chaos on the southern border, rather than an engineer or a doctor in their community who's, looking at who's providing jobs, who's doing so much good for the community. Even refugees and asylum seekers, they have so much net fiscal benefit to the United States. And yet, when you talk about, the refugee population or the asylum process, people generally have negative connotations to that.
Let's talk about some sort of reform efforts, particularly on the high-skilled immigration side, that have been floated in recent years, and what have been their fates and why.
People have looked at a lot of ways in which Congress could make some attempt at, some fixes on immigration. And it seems that doing something on high-skilled immigration would be the easiest, but at the same time, it's super hard in these times. Some of the ideas that people have looked at, like, there was a bill in last Congress, a bipartisan bill by Senator Moran, Senator Blunt of Missouri. So Senator Moran of Kansas, Senator Blunt of Missouri, Senator Warner from Virginia, and Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota. It's called the Startup Act. I believe the number was 328 in last Congress. What they were basically doing is, like, providing conditional permanent residence, so that's conditional green card, to 50,000 STEM degree holders, advanced STEM degree holders from U.S. universities, as long as they stay engaged in STEM fields post-graduation. And at the same time, they were also establishing a startup visa. So the United States is actually one of the very few countries that does not have a startup visa. If you want to create a startup in the U.S., tough luck. There are very, very few ways to do it, and they're extremely hard to get through. So that was one of the bills that gained some traction. Senators Moran and Blunt have been trying ever since, but seems to go nowhere. There were more recently in the Build Back Better last year, there were two provisions allowing anyone to adjust their status early. So early adjustment of status or early filing what was one thing. Actually, yeah, early filing. It was called early filing, and that would have cleared the backlog for some people in the employment-based category, in the family-based categories, to basically say that you're not getting a green card as such, but like we're gonna provide you the flexibility to switch employers, start your own thing. We're gonna provide you a lot of the green card benefits without giving you a green card just yet. That was in the Build Back Better. There was another thing, USCIS inefficiencies. It brings us back to like the inefficiencies in the federal government because of bureaucratic red tape and inefficiencies in USCIS and at the State Department. The federal government wastes like tens of thousands of green cards every year.
I found that shocking. And then you also seen the Biden administration. They say, oh, we're going to bring in like 100,000 refugees, and they only get to 20,000. Like, how does that happen?
How does that happen? So I think over the last 4 years, well, since 2016 to 2020, there was a systematic effort to hollow out the agency. People were not hired. In fact, career officials were quitting because of the political pressures. So the agency was just not, USCIS in particular did not have the staffing that it needed to process those applications. Over the last 2 years, USCIS has been on a hiring spree. They've been building back the administrative state. And for the first time this year, they had 280,000 green card applications that they processed in the employment-based category. So while they have 140 cap on employment-based, 140 cap on family-based, every unused family-based green card rolls over into the employment-based category for next year. And every unused employment-based category green card just incinerates. It vanishes. It no longer exists. It does not roll over. So since last year, State Department was more or less close to family-based green card applicants, and most of those applicants are outside the U.S., right? So we did not use the family-based green card numbers, and all of those rolled over into employment-based categories for this year. And this year, USCIS used all 280,000, and major props to USCIS for doing that. Last year, they wasted about 40,000 of the employment-based green cards that we will never be able to recover. Now, there are proposals in Congress to fix this problem. In the appropriations bill this year, the House-passed appropriations bill has a measure that would recapture all the unused green cards from previous years and fix this problem of incineration, while at the same time keeping family-based and employment-based green cards on two separate tracks. And that's important. That's critical. There are other provisions that Congress has been looking at. In the America Competes Act, the House-passed version of USICA, they had a provision to exempt any advanced STEM degree holder from U.S. universities or international universities. There was a qualifier that if you are from a non-U.S. university, your university has to be spending at least $25 million for the last 3 years on R&D. And that's the only reason, that's only how you would qualify. Because, while we want all the Carnegie Mellon and MIT grads to stay, we also don't want to miss out on any Oxford or Cambridge grads who want to come here. So that was a provision that passed. The House, there was some movement. A lot of national security leaders came out. President Trump's Deputy Secretary of Defense, David Norquist, former chair of House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry, and 47 other people, they wrote to the Senate and House leadership that needs to stay in the final bill. Unfortunately, it didn't make through due to Senator Grassley's objection, and he got a veto power, being the ranking member on Senate Judiciary Committee. Then the House tried again with that proposal, restricting it to people working in critical industries for national defense. And And that is how we arrived at the CBO problem, because that was being filed as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. There were 3 Republicans who were co-sponsoring it, Representative Curtis, Salazar, and Meyer. And now CBO was like, well, this is going to create $1 billion in deficits over the next 10 years. So to offset that, we created a $7,500 fee on every person. Then Ways and Means basically objected, saying that the fee was actually a tax because it would cover Obamacare subsidies that these people would use per the CBO. And so if there are Obamacare subsidies, then it has to be a tax. It's not a fee. Yeah. And scenario, it did not make it into the House NDAA. It was ruled out of order. Now the Senate has taken another stab at it. Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, Republican of South Dakota, and Senator Dick Durbin, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, they proposed a similar amendment. Just the changes are that you have to be educated at a U.S. university. You could have a master's degree, a PhD degree, and you have to pass a labor wage certification test. Basically, federal government's way of saying you're not cheap labor.
Yeah.
I don't know where that goes, but it's interesting movement.
So you have a PhD to do, but even that said, you apparently have enough time to get deeply involved in these sorts of discussions and negotiations. How does that work? How does someone who doesn't have a title as a legislative correspondent or a chief of staff to someone in the legislative branch end up being able to have these sorts of conversations?
Yeah, so I guess I had trial by fire. When I first came to my PhD program, there was the GOP tax plan in 2017, and one interesting bit of that tax plan was that they were going to start taxing graduate student tuition waivers. So, if you are a PhD student, you get maybe $30,000 in stipend. The university waives off your tuition fee. So the tax plan was saying, okay, even though you get $30,000, we're going to tax you at $80,000. That passed the House. We were fighting it in the Senate. It was a tough fight, but that helped me build some of these relationships that I still am in touch with, people I'm still in touch with. Then we had a lot of things happening in 2020. The administration tried to end the OPT program, where we had to get a lot of Republican support to preserve it. The OPT program being the optional practical training program, which allows foreign graduates to work for a year post-graduation, 3 years if they are graduating from a STEM degree. They tried to deport all international students who would not take classes in person. This was a directive from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent and the Department of Homeland Security. So we band together. My other job basically is as president of CMU's Graduate Student Assembly. So we band together in that year with a lot of other student governments to file an amicus brief in the lawsuit that MIT and Harvard brought against ICE. That lawsuit was settled, but we were the only students who were talking about it at the time. I helped the House Science Committee organize a hearing the same year on the impact of COVID-19 on university research. So, a lot of these things have come together because of my work with CMU's Graduate Student Assembly. And I think a lot of other students, if they started getting involved with their student governments, would find similar opportunities come their way.
Why are outside voices useful to Congress?
Yeah, so when I first met the House Judiciary Committee staff, for instance, they told me it was the first time they had heard from student governments. When we met Ways and Means staff on the tax fight, they were like, this is the first time we've met someone from a student government. This is the first time we met a student. And I think people undervalue the level of insight you are able to provide, especially if something impacts you directly. There might be things that members of Congress or their staff are not aware of that impact you. Policies they might be proposing might impact you in very weird ways, and they need to hear. They love to hear those voices. They love to hear anyone who has an interesting perspective on something they're trying to do or something they're trying to stop. And they try to get as much information as possible. It is hard for them. They're drinking from a fire hose. So making sure that if you have something important, valuable, interesting to say, that you say it.
And how does one say it? Like literally call your congressman and start from there? Like what's the process?
One thing I found very interesting is that they all read your local newspapers. If I'm a representative from Pittsburgh, I'm always reading Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And so we should start off. That is how I started off. Like just write about your experiences in your local paper. They would be happy to publish, and your member would get to read it. And then, yes, call them, write to them, try and get a meeting with the staffer you want on the issue you're most passionate about. Not just like, a lot of people are passionate about a lot of things, but they're not necessarily the experts on those things. So don't try to waste their time. But like, if you have something interesting, definitely schedule that meeting. They'll be happy to share their contact information over the phone, or you could like try and set up a meeting by emailing the office. It's pretty easy.
So this is what I've done, and just to make it even more concrete, like if there is a bill you are interested in, go to the website, figure out who sponsored it, look up that office's phone number, and say, hi. This is what I do. I say, hi, I'm Jordan Schneider. I'm a fellow at CNAS, a think tank, and I'd love to talk to you about this bill that you're writing. And inevitably, the person who picks up the phone will say, great, cool. The staffer is working on it. Let me give you their contact information. And then you send them an email and they talk to you. And I think it's really important to know, for everyone out there listening, that you don't need a think tank affiliation to do this. As long as you have some sort of reason that you can say you have something interesting to say about it. And, in your case, it was, I'm a student, this thing is going to affect me. It could be, I've written a paper on this, I've researched the topic, whatever it is. These staffers, they don't get a lot of calls like that, I think, particularly when it's not on...
Yeah.
Especially when you are not a lobbyist, right? And it's not like you want something out of them, like the sort of like public service input that folks receive in Congress that isn't like, it's not disinterested, right? Like, I care about these issues. You didn't want your taxes to go up, but it's very different. A PhD student being like, guys, I make $30,000 a year. Please don't turn that into 15. As opposed to, an oil lobbyist saying like, hey, can I like write off my investment in a, shale field or something? Yeah. And so I think people underappreciate the response that you can get as long as you have done a bit of homework and have something to say. And I think, what I found like surprisingly empowering is often, these folks will ask you questions. And, you might not have the answer, but they are not going to have the time to research the question. So if you can answer their questions by just doing legwork, you don't have to be brilliant. You just have to, call people or read some stuff. And then you come back to them a few weeks later and say, hey, that thing you were interested in, I looked into it and here's what I found. Like, you've got a friend for life because you're taking stuff off of their plate and making them smarter at their jobs. And I think that, especially when it's something that, you're interested anyways and you would be doing, it can be an incredibly sort of empowering experience. And like, whenever I've done that, it actually makes me really thankful that I live in a democracy. Not in a system like China's where this sort of thing would not happen. So anyways, give it a shot.
Once you do that, it's entirely possible that the staff will reach out to you the next time they're looking at something of, that's even tangentially related, they'll be like, oh, you know what? I had this meeting with this person once. Maybe they have something interesting to say on this.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is you don't also need to be the student president, of your graduate student union. You don't have to be a 5th-year, computer science PhD. You can literally be a really smart undergrad. And as long as you do homework and put time into it, this would be the thing. And actually, the only class I would want to teach in a graduate school would be doing this, because I think this is the part of sort of like, MAs in public policy or whatever that is just done incredibly poorly. Like, you have these like capstone things where like someone asks you something and you talk to them 6 months later. It's like, no, look at the bills that are moving and see if there's some little corner of it which you think hasn't been entirely thought out, or just interests you, and read about it. Because I can be almost certain that as long as you start small enough, if you put in 30 hours of work, you will be at or even potentially past the knowledge frontier of whoever was writing that piece of legislation. And that as like a civic American, or not even an American. I mean, Divyansh, you're here on a student visa, right? It does not take not take citizenship to be involved in this process. But if you do, it's just like your whole sense of, the possibility space of what you can accomplish as a private citizen expands in a really like beautiful and empowering way.
I think the bare minimum I've seen anyone contact a rep with, like, the lowest bar of a reason. I live in your district. You got to listen to me on this. That's it.
And okay, and then but like, it's one thing to be put in the but you don't want to be put in the I'm the crank calling about my heating bill, right? That is enough to get you. That is literally enough to get you a meeting. Is I'm a voter or whatever. And then from there, as long as you sort of are smart and respectful and responsible and are additive, the sky's the limit. Talk a little bit about the Day One project. How have you engaged with them, and sort of what type of work do they do?
Yeah. So the Day One project at the Federation of American Scientists is basically a way for subject matter experts to talk to policymakers. If you have an interesting idea to address a challenge that you see, and you think that there's an opportunity to address it, then come out with your plan of action and write a Day One policy memo that then you'll work with the Day One team to, find the appropriate people in the federal government who would take it to action. It's quite interesting. The way I engaged with it was before I got affiliated with them. I joined a policy accelerator, which Jordan was also in. It was the Progress Studies Accelerator. Jordan, we still don't have your memo, but
I know. I'm sorry. I'm writing you a new one. We'll talk about it later in the show.
Yeah. So if you are, say for instance, okay, I'll talk about my example. I had this interesting idea that the National Institutes of Health provides a lot of money to training grants, which are very successful. And the way training grants work is like a department gets those grants, and then our university gets those grants. Then they get to hire students who work on those grants. So the students are not tied to a particular faculty in their research. Whereas fellowships that NSF emphasizes a lot on, you give money to faculty and then you're tied to individual faculty. So the idea was, well, why not replicate the success of NIH's training grants to other agencies? You could add other things that NIH does, like having individual development plans for every grad student to every NSF training grant as well, if you are to establish that. And in fact, that did make it into CHIPS and Science Act. Now, every NSF grant that goes out, every PhD student who's funded on an NSF grant will have to work with their advisor on creating a one-page individual development plan which is quite amazing because that's been shown to be very effective in improving the quality of mentorship that these students get. And that goes to the point we were discussing earlier of like making sure that we have the talent to put these dollars to good use. What's a PhD student of use if they're not getting the right mentorship to be successful in their career, to be successful in their research area? So that is how I engaged with the Day One project. They were very interested in that idea. They helped me write it into a 2-page policy document that we then pitched to the people we thought would be the customers in the policy domain, in the federal government and the executive branch as well as the legislative, and it made it in, which is amazing. And I'm sure that if anybody out there listening has amazing policy ideas that are, you may not think that they're amazing. You may think that they're just common sense. But you don't know what the staffers will think. They might just think that oh my God, why did I never think of this? Yeah. This guy's amazing. This is an amazing idea. We could just like drop one line of text in an appropriations bill, an uncontroversial line, and it will dramatically change the whole landscape. Yeah. Come out, submit your idea through the Day One Project website.
So this idea of these sort of marginal, nominally bipartisan changes, I think generally when people think about political change, they think about, marches and mass movements and sort of like enormous bills. And there are those, and those are incredibly important. I think there's also, what I've learned over the past, few years of working with Day One Project and engaging, in a personal capacity with the legislative process is that it's not all that. And as an individual, like, you can have a higher degree of confidence that you will impact at least a little bit of change in the world if you at least start with these, one line here, one clause there, one paragraph of text here. And by doing that, and I think this is what you've shown in your work over the past few years, is like that sort of stuff is the training wheels to understand how big change happens. Because yes, mass movements and sort of national polling numbers and public opinion matters. But there are plenty of things that this system needs changed that hasn't been changed just because no one's staring at it and no one's using their voice in a kind of smart, active, and persuasive way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there are so many things, and I think the name itself reflects it. Like, policies that an administration can enact in day one. Like, what could you do? Like, what are the small things? What are the big things that an administration could do on day one? And that there are a lot of those things out there. Quite amazing how, people have all these ideas that they bring to the Day One project, and then we get to be amazed at everything. We also get a lot of other submissions. Like, recently we got a submission we should install a massive fire sprinkler to combat wildfires. And so, which was, okay, I get it. But we do get, like, there are amazing ideas that come through that process that I'm truly amazed at. Like, I'm just like, oh my God, why did I never think of this before? And so it's even on the, like, it's, while it's like, we tell people, okay, yes, think about what the executive branch could do. Think about the levers that they have to pull. Because obviously, yes, there is some truth to saying that Congress, the default is inaction. That is, it is true there's a good reason why people say that. But at the same time, there are also a lot of things in Congress that are extremely low bar. If you know a member, you've got who sits on the right committee, say on appropriations or defense, and you could just like get them to slip one line on a report, that will start a lot of things moving. Like, okay, maybe you want to change how the State Department processes visas, or maybe you want to change, how DOE collects some data or something, or how the education department works on some particular area. It costs nothing to get like a line. Okay, GAO will study so and so and so, or we'll establish a commission to study so and so and so, and that gets the ball rolling, because when those reports come out, they make a massive impact on the policymakers. One of my favorite ones was when GAO came out with this report that most students do not know about SNAP benefits that they can get, and all that needs to happen is the Department of Education needs to better publicize them. The Department of Education was like, great, we'll start better publicizing them. Yeah, and people who were talking to the Department of Education before that report, like, please, can you publicize it better? They were getting nowhere. So if you get like those small things happening, it's like dynamos, right? You move one thing and then suddenly there's a big thump on the ground and you get the desired results.
Yeah. And I think it's these sorts of like tips and tricks are not transparent and are things that you learn over time. And organizations like the Day One Project exist in order to sort of hold your hand from, oh, here's the thing, to, okay, how can we, make this a reality? I'd be very curious. This is a very American-focused show we've had over the past 45 minutes. If there are other organizations out there on the planet who do this sort of thing, I'd be very curious in how sort of like policy change happens in other countries. That'd be an interesting, follow-up show or two.
I would love to know that too.
It'd be really interesting. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah. What's the Indian version of this? Would it not exist?
I have no idea. I think like, well, I'd get into trouble if I say something. I don't want to get arrested the next time I land at the airport.
Oh no. Well, that's a problem. Worrying about that makes this a hard thing to start about.
Yes. It's very interesting. Like, people going to jail over Google Docs that they've created or a social media post that they've made. So, but I think there are some members of parliament who do propose like bills on their own. But normally in a parliamentary democracy, I believe it's, the cabinet makes a decision of what they're gonna do. The party lines up behind them, and things happen. I think it's a very American way of doing things, where individual members make their play, they recruit others to co-sponsor, and then anything could happen.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. It's a really interesting point. I mean, Sam Hammond of the Niskanen Center recently had a blog post talking about why American think tanks have an outside influence on the process. And the point he made was that parties in parliamentary systems have their own, like internalize the function of think tanks within the parties themselves. But I think it because of this sort of reliance on think tanks and academia as to generate the ideas, it also opens the aperture for something like the Day One Project, where it's just concerned citizens to play the same role that someone at Brookings or CSIS would, because the system itself is used to having random people just come up with things and pitch them and then get adopted and fed into the legislative or executive bloodstream.
Yeah, I mean, policy entrepreneurship, right? We want everybody to be a policy entrepreneur.
Oh, the thing I didn't want to leave hanging. So I didn't want to leave you guys hanging on my new a preview of my new Day One memo. Let me pull up the.
Hey, you're still writing it. We haven't guaranteed that we'll accept it.
Okay, all right. So let's talk through my idea real fast, just to give folks a taste of how the sausage gets made. Challenge and opportunity. So I think America does a pretty piss poor job of econ plus tech analysis to serve both economic and national security decision making. So there are organizations like the Office of Net Assessment that look at these types of questions, but strictly from a military perspective, or strictly from a sort of like Pentagon perspective. There are organizations like the intelligence community looks at foreign capacities, but isn't really allowed by statute to do comparative analysis of like, okay, the U.S., China is doing good at this, but like U.S. is also doing better or not doing as good. Their sort of analytical lens doesn't look domestically. And more than ever now, we are starting to engage in major decisions which are going to shape our sort of technological and by extension economic and societal futures, which could be served by injecting stronger analysis and expertise about established and in particular emerging technologies. So my plan of action is, as section 2 of the Day One memo goes, would be to set up some sort of research body, potentially connected or adjacent to the executive branch, potentially something with inside the Department of Commerce, maybe a kind of wing or a special funding line for an FFRDC, like a RAND or an IDA or STIPI that tries to do this sort of net tech assessment or global tech competitive analysis that looks at where the U.S. That looks at first, what are the industries that and technical specializations which are going to be most important? How is the U.S. and its allies doing in them relative to adversary nations? What would be important potential interventions that the U.S. government could pursue to help improve U.S. competitiveness? Yeah. How'd I do? What else do I need to do to start? How much more work do I need to do to start talking to congressional staffers?
So the question is there an existing opportunity where the executive branch could do this without congressional action? Does that exist? If there is a way to do that, then I think that's the easiest way to go, right? If not, well, if you're going to talk to congressional staff, what is the opportunity? How do you see them doing it? You have to like lay it on their plate, right? You have to give it to them on a silver platter that, hey, I've hashed it all out. It's likely gonna cost this much. It's within this jurisdiction. It can ride on this large bill, one of the 4 bills that are gonna pass next year or something like that. And this is how you should structure it. Who should, if you're creating a research body that Congress could provide oversight on, they love that. That's another thing to think of. Or is there an existing body that is there, just hasn't had any appropriations for, like the Office of Tech Assessment in Congress? Could you just be like, hey, could you just put money towards that? So what are the menu of options there? And how would each option work? What are the pros and cons of each option? What are the questions you anticipate someone to ask if you were to go pitch it to them? What challenges they might face? What are the potential success scenarios, failure scenarios? What's the best case outcome, worst case outcome? So what are those FAQs in this memo? I think those are questions that you have to think about, because we love to give them a good pudding. We don't want it, just halfway through.
So if those are the sorts of questions that you would be interested in exploring, get in touch with Divyansh on Twitter or reach out to the Day One Project and write up your idea. Submit it to their forum. It's a really fascinating and empowering way to spend some of your time.
Yeah, and if you're especially interested in emerging tech policy, like we have an accelerator with the I believe it's called the Racial Equity Accelerator, looking at AI governance, looking at the tech workforce, how to make sure that the benefits of those technologies are equitably distributed. You might even want to just sign up for that, though I guess, like, I don't know, probably the deadline for that will pass before you post this.
We end every episode with a song. Do you have one you'd like to choose? Relevant to this conversation or not?
The Immigrant Song.
Okay. That's too easy.
Relevant to this conversation. You gave it
Okay.
You gave it away. You want to do When the Levee Breaks?
It's dark. All right. Divyansh, thanks so much for being part of Chime Talk.
Thank you. Now I'm gonna go home. Gonna get a drink, work on my thesis.